In preparing for this video, I found the following books especially informative. Ronald Numbers' The Creationists is the best overview of the history of scientific creationist thinking. Numbers also authored Darwinism Comes to America, which provides insight into how American scientists responded to Darwin's dangerous idea in the late 19th and early 20th century. Trial and Error by Edward Larson proved particularly useful for understanding why anti-evolution sentiment grew to fever pitch at particular times in American history, as well as how evolution was treated in the textbooks students encountered at school. For considerations of more recent creationist thought in the form of the intelligent design movement, the books Intelligent Design by Edward Caudill and Creationism's Trojan Horse by Forrest and Gross are enlightening. You can find a list of these and some other books I found insightful in the description below. Darwin's theory of evolution is now a mainstay of biology education and the field of biology itself, but there was a time when most biologists believed in what's called special creation, or the idea that the various types of life were each created and have been propagating since without drastic change. Why did the scientific world shift to accept the idea of evolution? What did their creationist counterparts think of it all? And how has the history of scientific creationism in America unfolded since then? To be clear, when I say scientific in relation to scientific creationism, I'm not in any way meaning that to suggest that the arguments are scientifically serious or even scientific in all cases, but rather I mean to largely constrain my focus on those attempting to make scientific arguments rather than those who are making explicitly religious or moral arguments. Charles Darwin published his paradigm-breaking book on the origin of species in 1859. Ideas about evolution had been in the air already, and you'll often hear it suggested that what made Darwin's idea more palatable than prior arguments for evolution was the mechanism for evolution he proposed, natural selection. Organisms exist in and as part of nature, and through their interactions with nature, their survival is determined. Given that variations exist within species, some of these variations will prove more or less adapted to the given natural setting, and how many offspring one might have would be affected. In truth, however, natural selection doesn't seem to be what brought at least American scientists on board the evolution train. Instead, two other factors dominated. The first was Darwin's presentation of the various lines of evidence for biological change across time, and the second was the fact that American scientists were looking for a materialistic approach as materialism was on the rise and supernaturalism on the wane. When Darwin's idea broached the American border, it found an audience of scientists grown weary of supernaturalist thinking. Biologists were increasingly self-conscious about the fact that while materialism had taken over much of the other sciences, biology still relied on supernatural explanations. As American scientists increasingly adopted the arguments for evolution Darwin offered, they argued for various methods of how evolution occurred. Natural selection, Darwin's preferred method, was rarely atop anyone's list. Many, for example, preferred the idea that environments caused changes that would be passed on to the next generation. But for whatever reason any given scientist gave for why evolution occurred, more and more believed that it did occur. Specifically, belief in biological evolution went from being a rarity to the mainstay amongst American scientists over the 2 decades running from 1870 to 1890. Some, however, pushed back on evolutionary thinking. The earliest scientific critics of Darwinism were nearly uniformly not young Earth creationists. The prominent American scientist Louis Agassiz opposed evolution, and after his death, Arnold Guyot and John William Dawson picked up the mantle. None of these 3 men pushed for a literal 6-day creation some 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, and Guyot promoted the day-age theory, where the days of creation were extended periods of time and not literal 24-hour days. More generally, early on, the American creationists who felt compelled to take the Bible seriously were almost uniformly either day-age theorists like Guyot or gap theorists. Gap theorists had it that there was an unmentioned gap between the first and second day of the creation story described in Genesis, and much time and activity occurred during that gap. Some gap theorists placed the gap between days 6 and 7. One gap theorist from this time was Reverend and math professor Herbert Morris, who wrote an 1871 book arguing for lots of time between verses 1 and 2 of Genesis. In the early 20th century, public schooling was spreading wildly. With the increase of students attending school and the increase of evolutionary ideas in the textbooks, more and more children were encountering novel ideas that ran counter to their religious beliefs about life's history. Tensions grew. It's in this milieu that William Jennings Bryan begins his anti-evolution campaign, which culminates with the Scopes monkey trial. The anti-evolution crusade notched its first statewide win with the passage of an anti-evolution law in Oklahoma. When Tennessee followed in 1925, the ACLU sought out a Tennessee teacher to challenge the law on behalf of, and after finding John Scopes, the ground for the Scopes monkey trial was set. While many interpreted the trial as an embarrassment for Tennessee, the law itself was upheld and the anti-evolution crusade actually grew, peaking in the years following the trial. Tensions only simmered when textbook publishers accommodated the creationists and adjusted their books to treat evolution lightly, if at all, for the coming decades. One religious group, in particular, had a special aversion to understanding the 6 days of creation in Genesis as anything but literal days. For this group, the seventh day is of particular importance, and Seventh-day Adventist prophetess Ellen White clearly wrote that the days of creation were normal days. One man who stands out as an early critic of Darwin who argued for a literal 6-day creation was Seventh-day Adventist George McCready Price. Price criticized geologists and biologists in a number of ways, such as his argument that they used the rocks to date the organisms, and the organisms to date the rocks, leading to a logically unsound chain of circular reasoning. He was widely rejected by the scientists who cared to address his work. Price rejected claims for deep time and for significant evolution entirely, and William Jennings Bryan actually wanted Price to participate in the Scopes trial, but Price was in Britain at the time. After the fact, Price was angry at Bryan that Bryan accepted the day-age theory and didn't defend the literal 6-day creation. George McCready Price fancied himself well-informed on geology and opined that the geological fossil record didn't suggest a long history of life with epoch after epoch often showing starkly different life types. Instead, the geological record is just how the Earth settled after God flooded the Earth. This occurred because God thought humanity's wickedness was sufficient for him to murder all but 8 people and all animal species, barring a male and female of each, or 7 pairs of males and females of each if you were one of the luckier species, and the method of death was drowning. Thankfully, in the aftermath, it seems possible that it occurred to God that such an approach was excessive, and while God's morality might have evolved, biological life certainly did not. Instead, the flood settled and laid out the fossil record as we find it. Price pushed for his ideas throughout the early 20th century and persuaded some, but the breakthrough to dominance for flood geology wasn't to be. Nonetheless, before we reach the surge of young Earth creationism amongst scientific creationists in the early 1960s, a number of organizations aiming at criticizing evolution had emerged. In 1935, the Religion and Science Association was created in an attempt to get fundamentalists to come together around one interpretation of Genesis and biological history. Tensions between young Earth flood geologists and those with less constrained interpretations racked the organization, leading to its falling apart in 1937. The following year, an organization allowing only believers in flood geology and a literal 6-day creation was formed. The membership of this Deluge Geology Society climbed to some 400 members by 1942 and included a wildly disproportionate number of Seventh-day Adventists. Fractures soon emerged in the Deluge Geology Society, leading to the less intensely dogmatic wing rebranding as the Natural Science Society in 1945, while the shunned Allen soon started Amazing Discoveries Incorporated. Then there was the American Scientific Affiliation, which started chaotically before shifting into a theistic evolutionist stronghold. The American Scientific Affiliation, or ASA, was an evangelical organization founded in 1941. The ASA was never a strong young Earth creationist outpost and had a creed that testified to their commitment to treat the evidence of the Bible and of nature as equally valid testaments of the Creator. While there were pushes by some members for a young Earth creationist viewpoint, over the first couple of decades the organization became increasingly pro-evolution until it was dominated by theistic evolutionists. A 1954 book by ASA member Bernard Ramm pushed for accepting evolution to an extent, but also bursts of divine creation, and he strongly opposed the narrow reading of Genesis young Earth creationists promoted. The book was very successful and helped stoke the young Earth creationist backlash, leading to the publishing of the Genesis flood in 1961, which we'll cover soon. Another moving part at this time alarming the creationists was the resurgence of evolution in biology textbooks. Just as the uptick of evolution in textbooks and the spread of public schooling had brought anti-evolutionist activism to the fore in the 1920s, the 1960s saw a similar situation where the increased presence of evolution in textbooks stimulated strong opposition. The Cold War and Russia's scientific success had led to concern about the serious weaknesses in American education, and the government moved to push for strengthening science education. The Biological Science Curriculum Study began in 1958, and they produced biology textbooks in the 1960s that were unabashedly supportive not just of the truth of evolution, but of the theory's central role in modern biology. These new biology standards and biology textbooks that emerged came from scientists applying their own standards rather than textbook publishers accommodating creationists, and it turned out biologists thought it was high time for the religiously motivated repression of the theory of evolution to end. Other textbook publishers soon followed suit, and with evolution more front and center in textbooks than ever before, once again some religious folk were horrified. One young Earth creationist in particular was John Whitcomb, who'd been animated in opposition to Ramm's 1954 book, and he produced a thesis defending flood geology in 1957. Keen to find a scientifically informed co-author, Whitcomb recruited Henry Morris, a rear ASA member who was a young Earth creationist. In 1961, a book was published that proved pivotal to the world of scientific creationists. This was mostly a repackaged version of Price's Flood Geology. All life was created in 6 days, and most geological layers were laid down in the aftermath of the biblical flood. The Genesis flood sold over 200,000 copies over the coming 25 years, and Morris gave many speeches across the country. The book and Morris persuaded many evangelicals to reject the day-age and gap theories, and young Earth creationism came to dominate the scientific creationist movement. In 1961, an anti-evolution clique of under 10 members was formed within the ASA to combat the ASA's pro-evolution majority, but the group soon branched off as its own independent organization. Walter Lammerts and William Tinkle were behind the group, with Lammerts leading the recruitment efforts. Henry Morris was one of the members. They soon adopted the name the Creation Research Advisory Committee, which would become the Creation Research Society in 1963. Lammerts was elected president of the society, and despite adapting a anti-evolution stance, the members were sufficiently divided on the specifics so that their position statement didn't include assertions of belief in a young Earth and the flood geology of Morris. Morris followed Lammerts as president in 1967, and the organization slowly bled itself out of its old Earth creationists. One of the major effects of the CRS early on was their textbook project. Dealing with the deluge of evolutionary thought flooding the new textbooks, the CRS sought to produce a textbook true to their creationist creed. The book, Biology: A Search for Order and Complexity, was published in 1970. CRS also conducted research. Larry Butler oversaw CRS's research efforts during the early period, and Butler, a biochemist from Purdue University, was serious about trying to improve the research quality of creationists. In 1972, he offered the CRS's board members a scathing take on much of creationist research, and 3 years later he resigned. After offering some positive words about the CRS's most active and well-funded researcher, Clifford Burdick, Butler followed by describing him as epitomizing the very image we want to avoid, a non-rigorous approach to research, and most important, he seems to seek out and thrive on sensationalism. Another center for creationist research and promotion was founded by Henry Morris and Kelly Seagraves, the Creation Science Research Center. The Seagraves took full control in 1972, and Morris headed off with some allies to found the Institute for Creation Research, ICR. The Creation Science Research Center was greatly diminished in the ensuing years, while the ICR grew significantly, reaching many people through books, a newsletter, and engaging in many college debates. They even founded a graduate school. While some efforts had been made by creationists to start teaching creation alongside evolution, one state where the problem was even deeper was Arkansas, which had a long-standing anti-teaching evolution statute. Susan Epperson, a teacher, successfully sued the state over it, and in Epperson v. Arkansas, the Supreme Court handed down their decision in 1968, ruling that such a law violated the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, which forbade imposing religion through governmental means. banning evolution was now not an option. 6 years after the Epperson decision, in 1974, Henry Morris published a guide, Scientific Creationism, for high school teachers. The guide argued for teaching creationism by only focusing on the scientific aspect without religious references. A law student named Wendell Bird developed a legal theory framing creation science as science proper and developed proposals advocating for equal time to be given to evolution and creation. In 1982, in McLean v. Arkansas, the District Court for the Eastern District of Arkansas ruled that a law requiring balanced treatment of both evolution and creation science to be illegal to teach in biology class because the law that required this was religiously motivated and creationism isn't science. A challenge to a similar law from Louisiana reached the Supreme Court, and in 1987 the court handed down their decision in Edwards v. Aguillard, declaring the law to be religiously motivated, violating the Constitution's First Amendment anti-establishment of religion clause. In the 1980s, there appeared a new wing of creationist advocacy that rejected young Earth creationism, or at the very least, didn't require it in their arguments. Intelligent design, or ID, grew to be a very significant side in the creationist-evolutionist debate in the 1990s. Their growth and prominence owes at least some dues to the fact that American law made religiously based and religiously motivated arguments useless when trying to get the supernatural into the biology classroom. Intelligent design, on its face, did none of that. Philosophical arguments about the nature of science, criticisms of the fossil record, arguments from probability, and arguments from design dominated their intellectual armament. Nowhere would the Bible pop up, and nowhere was it claimed that the alternative to evolution was God. Instead, their arguments proved that life required an intelligent designer, who or what that designer was left unanswered, and only ever considered in the lightest of fashions. The phrase intelligent design first appeared in the 1989 book of Pandas and People. Pre-publishing, Pandas had included words like creation and creationism. After the court decision in Edwards v. Aguillard, these words intelligently mutated into the words design and intelligent design, which is how it appeared in the first print edition. Before Pandas introduced the term intelligent design, ID-like ideas were represented in two earlier books in the 80s, The Mystery of Life's Origin and Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. 2 years after Pandas came out, Philip Johnson, who played a pivotal role in launching the ID movement and shaping its legal and rhetorical strategy, published Darwin on Trial. Johnson was a law professor who, after becoming a born-again Christian, threw much of his energy into overthrowing the materialist dogma of biologists. In his mind, science presumed naturalism, so when scientists argued that evolution was a fully natural process, they were just expressing one manifestation of their broader presumption that supernatural explanations were inherently not science. Johnson was tasked with leading the anti-evolution efforts of the Seattle-based Discovery Institute. Some of the more prominent fellow travelers with Johnson at the Discovery Institute were Michael Behe, William Dembski, Stephen Meyer, and Jonathan Wells. Let's take a closer look at Behe and Dembski. Behe's great contribution was his idea of irreducible complexity. Some biochemical structures and processes performed functions that depended on numerous parts, with the removal of any part making it that the larger function can't occur. Natural selection wouldn't select for such structures and processes because any of the given things that would be selected for is not actually going to add the evolutionary advantage of the larger function. Such structures and processes were irreducibly complex and testified to a designer. Dembski was more mathematically minded and developed formulas for calculating the specified complexity of biology, which allegedly demonstrated that the complexity of nature was just way too much for natural selection to handle. The ID movement used philosophical, legal, mathematical, and scientific arguments to make their case. God wasn't brought up, and instead they settled for the softer claim of an intelligent designer of any sort. This offered a possible path around the legal limitations on creationism imposed by the courts, and there were a number of attempts to walk that path. One in particular in Dover, Pennsylvania, reached the courts. A school board in Dover voted to insert ID into the biology classroom by requiring that teachers read a statement before teaching the subject of evolution. The statement claimed that evolution is merely a theory, and an alternative to evolution is intelligent design. For students interested in learning more, the statement offered a book recommendation, and 60 copies of that book of Pandas and People had recently appeared as a mysterious gift to the school and were available in the school library. The ACLU took up the case for 11 parents to sue the school board, resulting in the case Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District. This case didn't go well for the intelligent design movement, and in his decision, the judge deemed intelligent design to be religiously motivated and not science. This, for the time being, shut the door on sneaking creationism light into classrooms through legal means, though as shown in this book, the legal bulwark against inserting religion into biology classrooms does not stop many individual teachers who include these ideas in their classes. Despite the significant efforts of creationists, the last couple of decades have seen a significant increase in belief in wholly natural evolution. In Gallup's surveys on the issue, evolution with divine involvement dropped 6 percentage points from 40% of public opinion to 34% of public opinion from 1999 to 2024. Those who believe in the more extreme claim that humans were created directly by God in their present form counted 47% of the population in 1999, but that fell to 37% by 2024. So 2024 saw a combined 71% of believers in at least some supernatural involvement in evolutionary history, which is a 16-point drop from the 87% of Americans who held such opinions in 2004, while belief in non-God involved evolution has been growing significantly, coming from 13% in 2004 to 24% in 2024.